Switzerland, August 1943. The night air is thin and cold in the Bernese Alps. A single bicycle cuts through the misted road, its headlamp dimmed with a strip of cloth. The man pedaling, mid-40s, tall, wearing a gray overcoat, glances behind him more than ahead. In his satchel lies a collection of brown envelopes sealed in string. Inside those envelopes, the Reich's most guarded secrets, Fritz Kolbe, a German diplomat, and a man about to commit treason, not for money, not for revenge, but for conscience. He crosses a narrow bridge under a half-moon, the Rhine below glinting like cold steel. Every creak of the wooden plank sounds like a confession. If the Gestapo were to catch him now, there would be no trial, only a bullet and a shallow grave. At the Swiss border post, a light flares, a guard's lantern sweeping across the darkness. Kolbe slows, forces a weary smile, hands over his travel papers stamped Auswärtiges Amt, the Foreign Ministry. His pulse races as the officer examines the documents, nods, and waves him through. The bicycle rolls on into neutral territory. Only when the guardhouse disappears behind him does Kolbe exhale. He dismounts, leans the bike against a fence, and listens to the silence of freedom, the sound of snowmelt running through the rocks, and his own trembling breath. Inside his satchel are more than 1,600 pages of Nazi correspondence, from Gestapo reports to confidential cables signed by Joachim von Ribbentrop himself. Hidden among them are blueprints, casualty lists, and orders for mass deportations. Kolbe is headed to a small apartment in Bern to meet a man who doesn't yet know his name, a representative of the newly formed Office of Strategic Services, the American Intelligence Service. In the OSS files, this unknown informant will soon be given a code name, George Wood. That night, as the two men speak softly over a desk lamp, the flickering light reflects off the documents. Hitler's empire laid bare in ink and paper. For the first time, the Allies have a spy inside the Nazi state. Berlin, 1940. The German capital hums with the rhythm of war. Trains rattle east toward the front. Air raid sirens echo in the distance, followed by the muffled thud of flak guns. Inside the marble corridors of the Auswärtiges Amt, the Foreign Ministry, the chaos of the outside world feels deceptively far away. Clerks shuffle papers stamped with the eagle and swastika. Telephones ring. Boots click on polished floors. At one of these desks sits Fritz Kolbe, a senior aide in the ministry's courier service. His face is unremarkable, his demeanor discreet. He wears the same brown suit every week, keeps his voice low, and never raises it in political debate. To his colleagues, he's a model civil servant, loyal, efficient, invisible. But behind that quiet exterior, Kolbe is suffocating. He's watched the transformation of his country from a republic into a police state. He's seen colleagues replaced by party loyalists, the competent purged, the corrupt promoted. When he refused to join the Nazi Party, his superiors began to sideline him, denying him promotions and overseas postings. Yet his rank still grants him one crucial privilege: access. As a diplomatic courier, Kolbe carries sealed dispatches across Europe, between embassies in Madrid, Lisbon, Bern. Inside these envelopes are coded messages, troop movements, industrial reports, and correspondence between Hitler's inner circle. Each trip makes him a silent witness to the machinery of dictatorship. He keeps his face expressionless as he hands documents to foreign diplomats, all while thinking, if only the world could read what I'm holding. There are moments of unbearable tension. Once, in 1941, a colleague jokes over lunch that the ministry should shoot the traitors among us. Kolbe forces a polite laugh, hiding the trembling in his hand. He knows he already is what they joke about, in spirit, if not yet in action. In private, he listens secretly to the BBC, one of the few windows left to the truth. Each night he writes in coded shorthand, not of espionage or plans, but of moral disgust. The world must know what these men are doing, he writes. If Germany loses its soul, there will be no victory worth having. Kolbe's mask of loyalty becomes his shield. He smiles in meetings, salutes when required, and keeps his hatred buried under decades of bureaucratic obedience. But inside, a decision is forming, one that will turn his desk at the Foreign Ministry into the most dangerous posting in Nazi Germany. Freiburg, Germany, 1933. The smell of rain lingers in the cobblestone streets. Posters bearing Hitler's face plaster every wall. Loudspeakers in the square announce the new Germany, promising unity and strength. Fritz Kolbe, then in his early 30s, stands in the crowd and watches as the swastika banners rise over City Hall. People cheer. He does not. Kolbe was never a man of politics. He joined the German civil service in the 1920s, idealistic, pragmatic, devoted to the notion that service to the state meant service to the people. But when the Nazis seized power, that idea turned into something twisted. Suddenly, loyalty meant silence, and patriotism meant obedience to a single man. He refuses to join the party, a decision that marks him instantly. His superiors warn him, "Fritz, you'll go nowhere in this ministry without the pin on your lapel." He answers quietly, "Then I'll go nowhere." Friends begin to vanish. Jews, socialists, diplomats who'd once spoken too freely. His mentor, a senior officer named Erich Kiep, is dismissed for refusing to pledge allegiance. Kolbe watches as his office is repainted with new symbols, his colleagues trained to salute portraits of Hitler between meetings. The air itself feels infected. By 1938, after years of isolation, Kolbe is assigned to the Courier Division. Ironically, the Nazis' punishment gives him access to the most secret channels of the regime. He becomes a messenger of lies, carrying reports of conquests and exterminations. Knowing every envelope he seals tightens the noose around Europe. Each journey he takes leaves him more determined to act. In Madrid, he overhears diplomats boasting about the bombing of Guernica. In Rome, he watches Mussolini's officials drink to the fall of France. He begins to think of the Reich as a body rotting from within, and himself as an infection it has yet to notice. By 1942, the war's brutality is no longer rumor. Kolbe reads internal reports on deportations to the east, casualty figures on the Eastern Front, and orders signed by Himmler himself. The documents describe millions as numbers, not lives. That's when his decision hardens. If he cannot fight on the battlefield, he'll fight with paper. Kolbe begins to memorize names, dates, routes, anything that could be useful to the enemy. But the enemy he knows is not the Allies. It's the men above him in Berlin. Each day he walks to work through Wilhelmstrasse, past the flags and soldiers, thinking, what if the truth itself could be the weapon? Bern, Switzerland, summer 1943. The Swiss capital hums with quiet tension, neutral on paper but alive with spies, Germans, Italians, Soviets, Americans, all circling each other through cafes and embassies. To walk these streets is to walk the fault line of the entire war. Among the businessmen and diplomats stepping out of the tram that morning, none look more ordinary than Fritz Kolbe. A worn briefcase in one hand, passport stamped by the Reich, he passes unnoticed through the streets of Bern. Hidden beneath his files are the first documents he intends to betray. Kolbe's plan is desperate, improvised. He knows no one in Allied intelligence, no network, no safe house. He only knows that Switzerland is one of the few places left where he might find someone willing to listen. His first attempts fail. British representatives refuse to meet him, afraid it's a trap, another Nazi counterintelligence ruse. The British Secret Service had learned to be skeptical. Too many defectors had turned out to be double agents. But Kolbe doesn't give up. Through a chain of acquaintances, he finds a Swiss lawyer sympathetic to the Allied cause. That man quietly arranges a meeting, not with the British, but with a small American office that has just begun operations in Bern, the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS. It is here that Kolbe meets Alan Dulles, the OSS station chief, an American lawyer turned spy whose cautious demeanor masks a sharp instinct for truth. Their first meeting takes place in Dulles's modest apartment on Herrengasse. The curtains are drawn, a single desk lamp illuminates the room. Kolbe opens his briefcase and lays out the files, authentic, stamped, bearing Ribbentrop's signature. Dulles studies them in silence. The paper smells faintly of cigarette smoke and Berlin air. "What do you want in return?" Dulles finally asks. Kolbe shakes his head. "Nothing, only that you use them well." For Dulles, this moment is unprecedented. The man across from him is a mid-level diplomat. No spy training, no handler, yet he's risking certain death to hand over some of the most valuable intelligence of the war. Among the papers, detailed lists of Nazi agents operating in Spain and Switzerland, cables describing industrial production, aircraft deliveries, and troop transfers, early warnings about V-2 rocket sites and secret weapons programs. Kolbe's information is so vast, Dulles struggles to believe it. But over the coming weeks, every detail he checks proves genuine. In coded OSS cables, Dulles reports back to Washington, a source in Berlin with direct access to Foreign Ministry communications, codenamed George Wood, material of highest reliability. That night, as Kolbe leaves the apartment, the Swiss air feels colder. He knows that every return trip to Berlin will now be a walk through fire, but he also knows he's no longer alone. For the first time, the Allies have a living artery inside Hitler's diplomatic machine, and its pulse runs through Fritz Kolbe. Bern, late 1943. In a small, dimly lit apartment on Kramgasse, Alan Dulles spreads a new set of documents across his desk. Each page is stamped Geheime Reichssache, top secret matter of the Reich. The courier who delivered them, Fritz Kolbe, sits silently by the window, listening for footsteps on the stairwell. Dulles runs his fingers across the pages, barely able to comprehend the scale of what he's reading. Names of German agents in Spain, Turkey, and Switzerland, blueprints for radar systems, production data for Messerschmitt fighters, intelligence on German troop morale. It's as if someone opened the veins of Hitler's government and let the truth pour out. Kolbe's espionage, codenamed Operation George Wood, becomes one of the OSS's most valuable assets of the entire war. His first delivery alone contains 1,600 pages of Foreign Ministry correspondence, revealing how deeply Nazi influence had penetrated neutral countries. The documents expose covert deals, sabotage operations, and the internal fractures within Hitler's circle. Each time Kolbe returns to Berlin, he risks his life to gather more. He sneaks documents from diplomatic pouches, memorizes cipher codes, and retypes copies on a small, portable typewriter in his apartment late at night. To disguise the sound, he turns up his radio, Beethoven's symphonies covering the rhythmic click of treason. When he returns to Bern, the OSS learns what the Nazi leadership plans before many in the Wehrmacht itself do. His reports include exact production numbers for aircraft and tanks, showing how strained the German war economy has become. Information on the V-1 and V-2 rocket programs, warning the Allies months before London is hit. Lists of Gestapo informants operating under diplomatic cover across Europe. Dulles cables Washington that George Wood has provided material of the highest order. Intelligence so reliable that British intelligence at first doubts it could come from a single man. But there's a problem. The British don't trust Kolbe's identity. They suspect a double agent. MI6 refuses to circulate his files widely, fearing deception. So Dulles makes a fateful choice. He bypasses London entirely, sending the documents straight to Washington under the OSS seal. In time, the Americans come to depend on Kolbe's stream of revelations. His intelligence helps Allied bombers locate industrial targets. It confirms that Hitler's generals are concealing losses on the Eastern Front and that the Reich's supply chains are collapsing under Allied pressure. And still, Kolbe asks for nothing. No payment, no extraction. When Dulles offers to smuggle him out of Germany, Kolbe refuses. "If I leave," he says quietly, "I can no longer help you. My country must be saved from within." By late 1944, George Wood has sent over 3,000 documents out of Berlin, the equivalent of an entire intelligence library, hand-delivered by a single man. Few spies in history have ever achieved so much alone. Yet in Berlin, he remains invisible. A man in a brown suit, carrying a briefcase, no one suspects. Berlin, 1944. The war has turned. The Allies are pushing through France. The Eastern Front is collapsing. Yet in the corridors of the Foreign Ministry, the illusion of control still reigns. Men in black uniforms bark orders, typewriters clatter, maps of Europe still show red arrows sweeping victoriously toward Moscow, propaganda frozen in ink. Amid it all, Fritz Kolbe moves like a ghost. He carries sealed pouches between offices, exchanges memoranda with ambassadors, and nods politely to men who would hang him without trial if they knew what he'd done. The Gestapo's headquarters, Prince Albrechtstrasse 8, is only a few blocks away. He walks past it every day. The documents he's carrying now are not propaganda. They are death warrants disguised as correspondence, orders for deportations, updates on forced labor quotas, reports from concentration camps. He reads them, memorizes what he can, and returns them before anyone notices they've been opened. Every journey to Switzerland feels like walking a razor's edge. He hides microfilm inside envelopes or in the lining of his suitcase. Once, a customs officer in Constance asks him to open his bag. Kolbe's pulse hammers so hard he can hear it in his ears. The officer glances at the stack of official papers stamped Foreign Ministry, waves him through, and lights a cigarette. Kolbe walks away with his heart pounding, each step heavier than the last. Back in Berlin, suspicion tightens. A friend warns him that the Gestapo is investigating leaks from the diplomatic service. Kolbe burns everything: personal notes, typewriter ribbons, carbon copies. He keeps only the next set of intelligence hidden inside a false compartment in his desk drawer. He begins to live in constant paranoia. He never writes letters in his own handwriting. He avoids the same cafes. He sleeps lightly, waking at every sound in the hallway. When the telephone rings, he hesitates before answering, expecting the voice on the other end to order him to report to the Gestapo. There are close calls. In late 1944, a colleague asks him to accompany a courier to Rome. The man is later arrested in Milan for espionage. Kolbe narrowly avoids the same fate. His name was almost on the travel manifest. Still, he persists. Each act of treason feels less like betrayal and more like duty. But the price is loneliness. He cannot confide in anyone, not friends, not family. His wife has left him. His son is serving in the German army, unaware that his father is working for the enemy. Kolbe once told Dulles in a rare moment of emotion, "I have no one to talk to. Only the truth keeps me company." The OSS recognizes his bravery, but the psychological strain is immense. Kolbe begins to look older, thinner, his nerves frayed. Yet every few weeks he still boards a train to Switzerland. Another delivery, another risk. He knows that if he falters once, history will erase him completely. Bern, 1944. At first glance, the Swiss capital seems untouched by war. Streetcars hum past fountains, students sip coffee under striped awnings, and church bells echo through the hills. But behind every cafe window and every polite conversation, another war is being fought, one of code names, forged passports, and briefcases that could change the fate of nations. Neutral Switzerland has become the nerve center of European espionage. German agents, Soviet couriers, British diplomats, and American officers all operate within walking distance of each other, pretending civility while trading secrets. Hotels double as listening posts. Consulates serve as spy nests. Every waiter knows to look away when two men speak too quietly over tea. For Fritz Kolbe, this world is both refuge and danger. Here, his Nazi papers grant him credibility, but also risk. Any slip, any overheard word, and the Swiss police could hand him to the German embassy in minutes. He arrives in Bern under the guise of official diplomatic duty, lodging at the Hotel Bellevue Palace, the same place frequented by ambassadors and journalists. His presence raises no suspicion. Yet every step he takes through the lobby, past German officers and Italian envoys, is an act of silent rebellion. Across town, inside a discreet apartment on Herrengasse, Alan Dulles and his OSS team work tirelessly to decrypt, verify, and distribute Kolbe's intelligence. The small office smells of pipe smoke and typewriter ink. Maps line the walls, pinned to one corner, a note that simply reads, "George Wood, priority." When Kolbe arrives, he removes his hat, sits down, and quietly produces another bundle of papers. The ritual is always the same. Tension, verification, relief. The OSS team can scarcely believe the reliability of his reports. Through Kolbe, they learn the Nazi hierarchy's internal feuds, Göring's greed, Himmler's secret diplomacy, Goebbels' despair. They receive first-hand evidence of Germany's dwindling oil reserves, its crumbling morale, and the shifting loyalties within its ministries. But Switzerland is not safe. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence, operates here too. Double agents roam freely, trading loyalties for cash. The Gestapo has begun tracing leaks back to Bern. Even Dulles is under surveillance. One night, Kolbe leaves Dulles' apartment later than usual. As he walks through the empty streets toward his hotel, he feels eyes on him. A man follows half a block behind. Slow, deliberate. Kolbe turns a corner sharply, ducks into a side alley, and hides behind stacked crates until the footsteps fade. He waits there for minutes, frozen, before daring to breathe again. That moment captures the fragility of his mission. One missed shadow, one question too many, and his story would end in a basement interrogation room. Still, the intelligence keeps flowing. Faster, broader, riskier. Dulles cables Washington. Our source within the German Foreign Office continues to deliver information of extraordinary accuracy. His moral conviction appears absolute. In Bern's quiet cafes, the world's future is whispered between two men, one from Berlin, one from New York, as Europe burns beyond the mountains. Winter 1944. Snow blankets the Alps as Allied bombers roar toward their targets hundreds of miles away. They are guided not only by radar or reconnaissance, but by intelligence gathered from a single man sitting behind a desk in Berlin. His name on OSS cables remains George Wood. Through Kolbe's documents, the Allies uncover the arteries of Hitler's war machine, supply routes, secret factories, diplomatic negotiations with neutral states. His information becomes the unseen scaffolding beneath several key Allied operations in the final year of the war. One of his most critical contributions, detailed intelligence on Germany's new V-weapon program, the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket. Months before London's first bombardment, Kolbe delivers reports pinpointing research sites at Peenemünde and testing grounds along the Baltic coast. That information allows Allied planners to accelerate targeted bombings of missile facilities, slowing the program that could have changed the course of the air war. He also provides intercept data on Nazi agents stationed across Europe, leading to the neutralization of entire espionage rings in Spain, Portugal, and Turkey. These revelations save Allied convoys from ambush, protect invasion plans, and expose high-ranking collaborators in neutral governments. Then, in early 1945, Kolbe passes one of his most shocking finds, a diplomatic cable detailing Himmler's secret attempts to negotiate peace with the Western Allies through intermediaries in Sweden. This confirms for Washington that the Nazi hierarchy is fracturing and that Hitler's grip on his subordinates is weakening. Alan Dulles later wrote that no other single source provided such depth or accuracy in real time. The U.S. State Department, using Kolbe's files, maps Germany's internal disarray months before its surrender, and yet, outside a handful of intelligence offices, no one knows the name Fritz Kolbe. He works in silence, never knowing which of his reports reached the right hands, or which of them may have saved lives. He can only hope that his words, smuggled across borders and typed on fading paper, are striking blows that rifles cannot. By the spring of 1945, Berlin is collapsing. Soviet artillery echoes through the city. Flames rise above the Reich Chancellery. Kolbe burns the last of his documents and prepares to flee. The Gestapo is arresting anyone suspected of treason. His apartment is nearly bare. He carries only a suitcase, his diplomatic passport, and the knowledge that the war he fought, alone, unseen, is finally ending. Berlin, 1945. The war is over. Ruins stretch for miles. The city reduced to ash and silence. Soviet soldiers patrol streets that once echoed with parades. The swastikas are gone, replaced by flags of occupation. Fritz Kolbe returns to a homeland he no longer recognizes. The Reich he helped undermine is dead, yet so too are the ideals he hoped might rise from its ashes. He walks, through the rubble of Wilhelmstrasse, the very corridor where he once carried Nazi files, and sees the broken marble of the foreign ministry scattered across the pavement. He expects, perhaps naively, that someone will want to know what he did, that the new Germany will honor those who resisted from within. But the silence is deafening. In the months after the war, Kolbe reveals his identity to the Allies. He meets again with Alan Dulles, now working in post-war intelligence. Dulles offers him refuge, even citizenship in the United States. Kolbe refuses. "I did this for Germany," he says. "I must help rebuild it." He applies for reinstatement at the new West German Foreign Office in Bonn, but the bureaucracy he once served, now staffed with many of the same men who quietly survived the Nazi era, rejects him. One official writes in his file, "Kolbe's actions were treasonous. Such people cannot be trusted in the new administration." The irony cuts deep. The very men who signed loyalty oaths to Hitler now call him disloyal. Former colleagues refuse to speak to him. Some cross the street when they see him coming. He takes work in obscurity, first with a small Swiss company, then as a trade representative in Africa. He lives quietly without recognition, carrying the weight of what he'd done and what it cost him. His only friend from the war years remains Alan Dulles, who rises to become the first civilian director of the CIA. Dulles never forgets the man known as George Wood. In a private letter from the 1950s, Dulles writes, "Kolbe was one of the bravest men of the war. He risked his life without expectation of reward. History will eventually judge him rightly. But history takes its time. For nearly 3 decades, Kolbe's name vanishes from public memory. He dies in Bern in 1971, aged 68, largely unknown. His legacy buried beneath the same silence that once protected him. It isn't until the 1990s, after the Cold War, after Dulles's papers are declassified, that Germany begins to reevaluate his story. Historians uncover the OSS files, revealing the scale of his contribution. Newspapers call him the best spy the Allies ever had. At last, the truth surfaces, not as a confession, but as a vindication. Bern, 1971. A man sits by the window of a modest apartment overlooking the Aare River. His hair is gray now, his hands thin. On the desk beside him lies a worn briefcase, the same one that once carried the secrets of the Third Reich. Inside, a few faded papers remain. Letters, news clippings, and an old photograph of a younger man in a brown suit standing before the Foreign Ministry in Berlin. Fritz Kolbe has lived quietly for years, far from the headlines, far from the recognition he never sought. He has no medals, no monuments, no official gratitude. But what he does have is something rarer. The knowledge that in the darkest years of his nation's history, he chose conscience over comfort. When he dies that year, the world barely notices. Yet decades later, his name will resurface, not in intelligence circles, but in moral ones. Historians looking through OSS archives in the 1990s find cables labeled George Wood, top priority. Inside are thousands of pages in Kolbe's handwriting, detailing Nazi operations that shaped Allied decisions during the war. His reports are called one of the most important human intelligence sources of the conflict. In 2004, the German Foreign Ministry finally acknowledges him publicly, naming a conference room in his honor, a quiet, symbolic act that comes 60 years too late. A plaque reads simply, "Fritz Kolbe, a man who followed his conscience when others followed orders." Alan Dulles once described him as the only man I ever met who was truly selfless in espionage. That statement carries a certain irony. In a world built on secrecy and deceit, Kolbe's greatest weapon was honesty. He never fired a gun, never commanded troops, never stood on a battlefield. Yet through his courage, lives were saved. Battles were influenced, and truth was weaponized against tyranny. His story reminds us that espionage isn't always about deception. Sometimes it's about integrity, carried in silence. In the final accounting of history, Fritz Kolbe stands not as a spy in the traditional sense, but as a man who refused to surrender his humanity. He betrayed his government to remain loyal to his country. He risked his life, To preserve the lives of others, he chose the truth, when lies were the law. And in that choice lies his enduring legacy, that even in a world consumed by fear and obedience, one person's conscience can still rewrite the course of history.